Let's sew a Flying Geese quilt block, and I'm going to show you my top tips to not lose those points. Now, if you're new here, my name's Stacey and this is part of my Block of the Month series. If you'd like to know more and join us, I'll put a link down below. We'd love to have you, but for now, let's get on and make our Flying Geese quilt block. You can find a copy of these cutting instructions over on my website. I'll put a link down below. I also have a PDF pattern that you might like to purchase, and I'll put a link for that down below too. On the wrong side of all four A pieces that measure 4 inches by 4 inches, I'm just going to draw a diagonal line from corner to corner. So I'll just take my ruler, find the top corner, line it up at the bottom, make sure it's still lined up at the top again, and then draw my line. And I'll do that for all 4 pieces. Then I'm going to take my B piece that measures 7.5 inches by 7.5 inches, and then take my A pieces that I just drew the line on and place one in the bottom right hand corner, lining up these edges here, making sure that that line we drew meets the corner here, going up towards the other corner. Then I'll take a second piece and put that in the top left hand corner, again lining up those edges, and then we want that line to be coming all the way through, creating a straight line. Then when we're happy that's straight, I'm going to pop a couple of pins in. Now you might have noticed that it's overlapping here. That's perfectly normal. That's what it's meant to do. So don't worry about that. I think I forgot to mention that I've placed these A pieces onto our B fabric, right sides facing each other. Now we're going to sew. So I'm stitching at stitch length 2. I've got my 1/4 inch foot on to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to sew along both sides of my drawn line, and I'm using wonderful confetti thread. So I'm just going to start on that very edge and then sew until I get to the other side. Coming off the very edge, cutting my thread, and then I'll just turn around and carry on along the other side. Okay, now we're going to cut. I'll just remove those pins and we'll move on to the next step. So now taking my ruler and lining it up right along that line we drew, and then when I'm happy, I'm going to cut. Now we've got our 2 pieces, we're going to press. So I'm just going to set my stitches, and then I'm going to fold back this top piece, give it a finger press, make sure there's no creases in there, and then press. And then I'll do the same for the second piece. And I'll repeat this for the other half that we cut. With one of the pieces facing right sides up, I'm going to take another one of my A pieces with the diagonal line drawn on it and place it on the corner here of our B fabric. And then I want that diagonal line coming in and facing towards the open V here. So now once again, I'll just pop some pins in. And I will sew along both sides again with that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Removing the pins, and then let's cut along that diagonal line again. So just placing my ruler along the drawn line again, and then when I'm happy, I'll cut. Oh, I'm just going to miss a few threads there, and then I'll do exactly the same for our second set. Okay, let's press again. So we're going to set our stitches and then fold this piece up, and we're going to press towards our A fabric, giving it a finger press and pressing. And we'll do exactly the same for the remaining 4 pieces, 3 pieces, making 4 in total, that is. Now we need to square up our Flying Geese so that they measure 3.5 inches by 6.5 inches. And I have a ruler that is exactly that by Creative Grids. And I've got a diagonal line that goes this way, and it lines up perfectly. So I'll line up those two diagonal lines, and then I just need to trim all the excess off. Now you'll notice the key to getting really nice points is if I pop this ruler back on top, where it intersects there, it's exactly 1/4 of an inch over to where we're going to cut, which means if we then sew that with a 1/4 inch, we're going to get those perfect points. Now, if you don't have a 3.5 by 6.5 inch ruler, what you need to do is measure out your 3.5 inches and then pop your diagonal line on that line and cut. And just make sure you are getting your 1/4 inch here, which is so you get your perfect seam allowance for those points. So I'll just cut mine now, and I'll do this for all 4 Flying Geese. So now we need to sew our Flying Geese so that they're all facing in the same direction. So I'll just take these two, place them right sides together, line up these edges and sew, and I'll sew on this side where I can see my stitches intersecting, and then I'm going to be able to make sure I'm not sewing off those points there. So I'm just going to line up all my edges. And then I'll just pop one near the center. I'll sew along that edge, and then I'll make sure they're still facing the right way, add on the next one and then the next one. Let me just show you how I'll sew this one. So starting on that very edge, removing the pins as they get in the way. And then when I come up to these seams, just making sure I'm sewing them down in the direction they were pressed. And where those stitches intersect, I'm just making sure I don't sew past where the point is, because then I'll be cutting off my point. So just going nice and slow at this part. Coming off the very edge. And then let's check our point. And there we have it. That looks really perfect. I'm really happy with that. If you're not happy with that, you've got 2 options. Can you live with it? Because if you can, then just move on. But if you can't, it only takes a minute to unpick those stitches and try again. So now I'll just move on and carry on sewing the rest of my pieces together. So now I'm just going to set the stitches for each of the pieces that we sewed. And then I'm just going to press the seams up towards that B fabric. Okay, now moving on to our final step. Now we've got our Flying Geese all sewn together, we need to sew the sides on. So our side pieces for our C fabric measure 3.5 inches by 12.5 inches. All I'm going to do is place this piece right sides together, and then I'm going to pin it. I'm going to pin it on this side. I'm going to line up all the edges. I always like to start at the beginning and end. And then do the center. Now with those points, because of the way that we've pressed them, we can't actually see where our stitches intersect. So something I like to do, I don't know if you know of an easier way, but this is what I like to do, is just open it up in the middle there. And then where I can see my point, I'm just going to do a little dot here with my washable marker, which is going to come through onto the front. So I know to make sure I sew on this side of my marked dot, so on the edge side of it. If I go over the dot, I'm going to probably sew my point off. So let me know if you've got a better way of doing this. I used to use pins, but I do find this is a little bit easier and a little bit more accurate. Be fiddly opening it up. Okay, now let's sew along that seam. So as I come up to that seam again, being extra careful it's being sewn down in the direction it's pressed, keeping an eye on the mark that we did, and then carrying on. You'll actually find a stiletto is useful just to make sure those seams are being pressed in the right direction and you're not putting your fingers too close to the needle like I just did before. Okay, coming off the very edge, and then we can check. And I haven't sewn any of my points off, so that's looking fantastic. I'll do exactly the same for the other side. So I'm just going to set my stitches again and then open it up and press our fabrics towards our C fabric or our solid piece on the side, finger pressing and pressing. And we'll do that on the other side as well. And then I'll give the whole block a once over. And there we have our Flying Geese quilt block. Isn't it just lovely? And I haven't lost any of my points, so I'm really happy with that. Well, I hope you enjoyed this Flying Geese quilt block tutorial. If you'd like to see more block ideas, remember this is my Block of the Month series, so I'll put a link up above with my playlist for all the blocks we've done so far this year. Thanks so much for watching until the very end. I really appreciate you.